The ascension of the weakest leader in history.
Mr. Reagan.
In recent days, we've seen a purge on social media. There's been a crackdown, unsanctioned speech in America. So I will not be discussing politics today. Rather, I'm going to be reading for you a short story I wrote. This story is from a series of science fiction stories that I'm going to be reading on this show from time to time, called The Epic of Terth. Now, this story is entitled The Ascension of the Weakest World Leader in History. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, there was Terth. Terth was a beautiful planet. It was the third planet from the star Los in the Wilkie May galaxy. Terth had just the right conditions for life to flourish, and upon Terth lived many alien races within many Terthly nations. One nation, which was called the Unified States of Mercuria, had just practiced a tradition they called the Great Selection of the Executive. This was their quadrennial ceremony in which they chose the Mercurian leader for the next 4 years. But something was different about the Great Selection this year. Many believed the selection was crooked, that it had been manipulated in some way. You see, within the country of Mercuria, there were two parties, the Freepublicans and the Decepticrats. 4 years previous, the Republicans had won the Great Selection, and the Decepticrats were furious about this. They believed Mercuria was theirs to control, and they would not tolerate the rule of a Republican. The Decepticrats were particularly frustrated because the Republican who won the election was an outsider, someone they did not control, someone who wasn't interested in their political cronyism. This great Republican leader called the wicked gang of corrupt politicians embedded in the country's capital city, the city of Jefferson, D.C., he called them the Bog. And when he was selected by the people, he had promised to drain the bog. But these bog dwellers, the Jeffersonian establishment, they absolutely hated this man, and they made up their minds to do everything in their power to drive him from political office, to destroy him. The truth was that this man, the outsider, he was without doubt one of the greatest executives that had ever ruled over Mercuria. His name, Donaldus J. Trumpius. I'll read more from The Ascension of the Weakest World Leader in History from the Epic of Terth in one moment. First, I have to sell you something. Wow, Harry Dent just said gold prices will see the strongest boom in history after reset this level. He's predicting $5,000 in a new interview. With gold set to skyrocket, your timing is perfect. Start a qualifying gold IRA or 401k, and Noble Gold are gifting an incredible solid 22-karat American gold eagle coin in a beautiful presentation box. And they don't have many of these coins, so this offer ends in January. Call 877-646-5347 and get this special coin offer and get in early. That's 877-646-5347. Make sure to mention me, Mr. Reagan, when you call. Welcome back. Let's continue, shall we? The evil Decepticrat bog dwellers hated Mr. Trumpius even more because of his great success as the executive of Mercuria. And so upon the run-up to the next Great Selection, they developed a nefarious plan. A plan to doctor the results of the Great Selection in their favor. In a devastating turn of fate, the doctoring of the Great Selection was, in fact, successful. The mighty Donaldus J. Trumpius was soon to step down from his position as executive over the country. In his stead would sit a curious figure, a man that no one thought could competently rule the nation of Mercuria, a man so weak, intellectually feeble, and uncharismatic that not a single Mercurian was excited to vote for him. Even the most loyal Decepticrat voter lacked any excitement at all about the candidate. This feeble old man was called Bo Jiden. Despite the fact that no one really wanted to vote for Bo Jiden, somehow Mr. Jiden won the Great Selection. No one could really figure out how this was accomplished. The Decepticrats had used futuristic technology to tally the votes. They used machines called domination tally machines, and many believed that those tally machines had been doctored in favor of the Democrat candidate, Bo Jiden. But nobody really knew. There were countless theories, dozens of red flags, but no smoking gun evidence, and so Decepticrats seemed to get away with their plot. But why Jiden? It seemed odd that the Decepticrats would have chosen such a feeble leader. Well, It makes sense when you consider that the Decepticrats were the most repugnant, evil people in the universe, and they wanted somebody in office who could not stand against them. A pawn, a puppet. They wanted somebody that they could control. But was it really the Decepticrats who wanted an executive that they could control? Or was it someone else? For a very long time, many people believed that the Decepticrat bog dwellers had designed and executed the plan to steal the selection all on their own. But some were beginning to suspect that there was collusion between the Decepticrats and a foreign power, the Chinesians. Mr. Patrick Pern investigated and exposed evidence that the Chinesians were the ones behind the theft. He said to a newspaper called the Epoch Times, "There's a code buried within the domination machines that's turned up, and it seems to show Chinesian provenance." Now what this means is that there is hard evidence of direct Chinesian interference with the Great Selection. The Chinesians may have gone in and fiddled with the selection count themselves. Mr. Patrick Pern has been digging into all of this, and he has plenty of evidence to support this Chinesian connection.
So Patrick, I followed you on Twitter. I saw that you posted something in Georgia, and the ballots were being shredded, and then there's like a receipt found from Chinese print shop. Tell us a bit more.
That's correct. We located some operation in Georgia in Fulton County. We sent somebody into the warehouse, took samples from 3 different piles. Big piles. We had those tested forensically by 2 federally certified forensic examiners. They have confirmed one of those ballots is not legitimate, the other 2 were. 4 hours later, an Enterprise rental van backed up to the warehouse, loaded it all up and disappeared. We know that the next day, a shredding operation, somebody brought them a bunch of ballots to shred, and they shredded them, but some things stuck to the side of the van, some complete ballots, and a receipt from a Chinese company that shipped the ballots to the United States. So they were counterfeiting ballots in China again to be used in Georgia and I believe other states as well.
Tunisia was one of the most powerful nations on Terth. It was so powerful, in fact, that Tunisia had come to rival the great power of Mercuria. What was even more concerning, however, was that the Chinesians were closely connected to many of the Mercurian politicians. They were so closely connected, in fact, that it was suspected by many that the Chinesians were in possession of compromising information on those politicians, and that they were leveraging those politicians through blackmail. If this was true, then Tunisia now controlled the Mercurian government. On December 5th of the Terthian year 2020, the director of Mercurian National Intelligence, Ron Jatcliffe, announced that the nation of Tunisia has targeted several dozen Mercurian statesmen. Several dozen. Several. That was more than a few. That was like 5 to 10 dozen. That would have been like 60 to 120 statesmen. And that was a lot. There were only 535 total statesmen in the whole of Mercuria. Specifically, Mr. Jatcliffe wrote, "This year, Tunisia engaged in a massive influence campaign that included targeting several dozen statesmen and their aides." And he said that Tunisia used both public and secretive pressure to push lawmakers to its bidding, wittingly or unwittingly. And those are just the statesmen that he was aware of. How many have been targeted that he doesn't even know about? One famous Tunisian infiltration within a Mercurian politician, an infiltration I'm sure every reader of this story will have heard about, was the business dealings between the son of Bojaiden, Bunter Haydn, and a Tunisian company connected to the Tunisian government. Bojaiden's son made a lot of money through his business connections with Tunisia. But there was another, even more concerning connection between the Tunisians and Bunter Haydn. You see, Bunter Haydn had actually represented a Chinese executive convicted of bribery, a man by the name of Hattrick Po Pi Ching. One problem with the executive-elect's son, Bunter Haydn, was that he was addicted to a terrible drug called fissure. Bunter Haydn smoked a lot of fissure. At one point, Haydn's personal photos were uncovered, exposing images of him smoking this fissure, and implicating his father, Bojaiden, in his dealings with Tunisia. The humiliating images were of little consequence. The problem was that he was doing business with wealthy Tunisians closely connected to the Tunisian government. It would have been natural for the evil government of Tunisia to use his fissure addiction against him. They would likely have gotten him high on fissure, put him in a compromising situation, perhaps a sexual situation with underage Terthians. And high on fissure, perhaps unaware of what he was doing exactly, the Chinesians may have collected video evidence of Bunter Hyden committing serious crimes that would compromise his father, Bo Jiden. Again, if that were true, the Chinesians would now control the executive of Mercuria. Remember, this is all a fiction, ladies and gentlemen. This all happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. All right, where were we? Another famous infiltration was the Mercurian statesman Erect Swallowwell. Erect Swallowwell was a pathetic beta male, a miserable ginger cockroach, who once suggested that a war between the federal government and the Mercurian people would end with the annihilation of the Mercurian combatants via nuclear weapons. Erect Swallowwell was seduced by a Chinesian spy by the name of Bang Bang. Bang Bang was a cute little Chinesian girl, and Swallowwell was thrilled by the attention she gave him. Soon, Erect Swallowwell was in love. But Bang Bang never actually loved Swallowwell. She had an ulterior motive for spending time with the Crimson Councilman. She was attempting to infiltrate the Mercurian government, and she succeeded. Swallowwell, despite being compromised by the Chinesians and, in fact, with their help, was elected to federal office and eventually appointed to the Mercurian State Intelligence Committee. That seemed pretty irresponsible for the creature of the State House, to appoint a statesman compromised by the Chinesians to the Intelligence Committee. And it makes you wonder if the creature of the House herself might be compromised. There have been a few other high-profile infiltrations of Chinesian spies compromising top-level Mercurian statesmen. Fian Deinstein was famously exposed as having hired a Chinesian spy for 20 years. And even worse than Swallowwell, Deinstein was the chairman of the Mercurian State Intelligence Committee. The freaking chairman. Those sneaky Chinesians did a pretty dang good job of infiltrating the Mercurian government at the highest levels. The Mercurian holographic news company, Nox Fuse, just broadcast breaking news about the former statesman Barbara Doxer. This was reported by the great Nox Fuse host, Cucker Tarlson. Barbara Doxer was an incredibly high-ranking statesman for decades. She eventually retired from political life, but because Mrs. Doxer was such a powerful statesman, she attracted the attention of the Chinesians. They presented her with a lucrative business opportunity, and she agreed to work with them. The business was a Chinesian surveillance company. Barbara Doxer then officially registered as a foreign agent with a Chinese surveillance company. When this was exposed, naturally, it appeared scandalous. A former high-ranking Mercurian statesman registering with a foreign agent, a former high-ranking Mercurian statesman registering as a foreign agent with a Chinese surveillance company? She promptly deregistered because it looked pretty dang bad. It almost seemed like she was conspiring with a foreign adversary against her own nation. But that's typical for Decepticrats. Possibly the most concerning case of Chinesian influence was the case of Rich Reconnell. Rich Reconnell was not a Decepticrat. In fact, Rich Reconnell was the leader of the Republicans in the State House. He also has intimate ties with Tunisia. His wife is from the nation of Waitan, and her father is a prominent businessman born in Haishang in Tunisia. The likelihood that Rich Reconnell is compromised, I'd give it something like 99.999999999% chance. With Ron Jatcliffe's announcement that the Chinesians had attempted to influence several dozen Mercurian statesmen, and with the new executive Bo Jiden likely compromised, and with Erect Swallowwell, Fian Deinstein, Barbara Doxer, and Rich Reconnell all likely compromised, who else might be compromised that we're unaware of? As I indicated before, you've got to wonder about the creature of the State House, the Great Witch, Pansy Nolosi. Nolosi had often claimed that the leader of Sovietsky, Vladimir Putin, was blackmailing Donaldus J. Trumpius.
What does Vladimir Putin have on President Trump, personally, politically, financially, in any way? I don't know what the Russians have on the president, politically, personally, financially, or whatever it is. What is Putin blackmailing President Trump with? Personally, politically, or financially?
On Terth, when Decepticrats accuse Republicans of a crime, it almost always indicates that the Decepticrats themselves are involved in that very crime. This makes me wonder, what do the Chinesians have on Creature Nolosi? And remember when Trumpius canceled spaceship travel from Tunisia because of the mild space virus that had plagued the planet of Terth? Nolosi fought against it. She even went to Tunisia town and said, "Everything here is perfect. We love our Tunisians." Also, consider that in the past few days, Pansy Nolosi has been on a tear. Some have claimed that her conversation with the director of the Conjunct Chieftains of the Faculty, Nark Nili, was in fact an attempt to organize a military coup against the executive, Donaldus J. Trumpius. She also tried to impeach the executive, and she's even demanded that the vice executive activate Article 25. Why would she have wanted him out early? What was her problem? Social media organizations throughout Terth, Facebook, Twit, and Tuyub have all banned Mr. Trumpius from their platforms. Was this their own decision, or were they ordered to do this? More importantly, who was controlling Pansy Nolosi? Might it be the Tunisians? It's obvious that this is common practice by the Tunisian government, so it's not out of the realm of possibilities. It's a question worth asking. And so it was that upon the planet Terth, it was suspected that the great selection of the executive was doctored by the government of Tunisia. The Tunisians had likely already compromised much of the government of Mercuria, including the great witch, Pansy Nolosi, and they were now in total control of the Mercurian government. And that is the story of the ascension of the weakest world leader in history. Let me know if you enjoyed today's totally fictional story of Terth, and tell me if you'd like to hear more of these grand tales. I'm not going to tell these fictional stories every episode, of course, but as censorship becomes more and more severe, I find that when particularly sensitive issues arise in our culture, it's probably best to just ignore them and to instead tell you guys a fun mythical tale to dive into the entirely fictional world of Terth. Anyway, that's it for me, and remember, it's not that our Decepticrat friends are ignorant, it's just they know so much that is not so. Good night.
We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening.